Well, a couple of weeks ago, I did a versus review between Final Fantasy XIV and Guild Wars 2. You guys loved the review. I had some really wonderful feedback on it. A lot of people have watched it as well, which I'm very happy about, because, you know, it's not a Guild Wars 2 video. It's kind of out of my wheelhouse. So I wanted today to go through some of those comments, do some follow-up discussion. So anyone who enjoyed that video, wants to talk about comparative points between Guild Wars and Final Fantasy and just MMOs in general, this will hopefully be your video. I picked a bunch of comments from there, usually the ones with a lot of thumbs. I do recommend, if you guys haven't seen the original review, you might want to check it out. Pause this video, go have a look. I'll put a link to it in the description or the comments or something. And otherwise, let's jump in and see what you guys said, because there was some pretty cool feedback. Okay, so the first comment here we've got from Mr. Brightside, Killers fan, I suppose. It says, best MMO experience for me through all the years is playing both, because each game scratches a different itch. So yeah, let's talk about this first of all. I did a versus review, you know, Final Fantasy versus Guild Wars 2. Really, I might have mistitled it, to be honest, or the idea of the project. I'm not actually really interested in pitting the two games against one another, as though they're in some kind of arena and only one can take your time, only one can have your attention. Really, I just wanted to compare them. I wanted to compare the way they do things. I did have a lot of messages of people saying, oh, you know, this is a silly idea because the games are so different, blah, blah, blah. But that's precisely why I liked the idea of having that conversation. They are both MMOs. They are similar in several attributes. And like just seeing how one studio does one thing and another does another, I think it's quite fascinating. It's not that we have to come out at the end and say, okay, this person's the victor, this is the one that you should actually be spending your time with. Because yeah, the truth is, and I do believe in this as well, that both games you can play alongside one another. Final Fantasy's director, as far as I understand, has like explicitly said in some of the press for this new expansion, Endwalker, of which I know very little for what it's worth, but I'm pretty sure he's been explicitly saying, yeah, we've made this game specifically so that you can play it alongside other games. We don't want you to feel locked in or so on. And I think that's an astounding statement, especially for a subscription fee based product. You know, saying something like that is a real risk. And then you look at Guild Wars, and as far as I know, through all the years, certainly in this kind of context where, you know, it's a head up at the studio, ArenaNet's never been brave enough to say, hey, play our game alongside other stuff. Even though what a lot of is in Guild Wars 2's DNA is the idea that it's supposed to respect your time and it's supposed to be something that you can do while holding down a full-time job and so on. I think ArenaNet's ideas were more about, okay, people have other things occupying them life, not just video games, but the quote over on the Final Fantasy side is very much just about, like, you can even play other MMOs if you want. So I think the result is, in the end, that yes, both games do things very differently in some departments, very similarly in others, but they can be comboed. You know, MMOs are this weird thing where there is a lot to play through. They are massive products. Even smaller MMOs out there are huge time sinks. So it's not really about money that you have to spend on having multiple subs. I think just in general, the genre leads to people picking one game or another. But if you're gonna play two alongside one another, I do kind of think Final Fantasy and Guild Wars are doable. Now, my perspective for this is kind of weird, and, you know, there wasn't a big discussion in the original review about this, but I'm still just getting caught up in Final Fantasy at this point. My hours in that game are huge, don't I? The last /age I think I did in the game, or /playtime, wasn't I closing in on like 700 hours or something? And the thing is, guys, I basically am 2 expansions behind at this point. I don't think I was really explicit in the original review, but I'm at the end of the Stormblood expansion now. I'm right at the start of Shadowbringers. And so I've got that whole expansion to do. When it came to Stormblood, it took me a month. At the pace at which I play games, the speed at which I go through the story, the depth at which I go to doing side quests and unlocking all the other features and stuff, genuinely, it took me 30 days. And I know that fact because the very start of the Stormblood expansion was when I first had to pay for a sub. And in fact, at that point, they gave me 30 days free. So my 30-day free trial ran out, like, literally just a couple of days ago. And that's right as I got to the end and right as I'm on the cusp of Shadowbringers. So here's the thing. It took me a month just to do that. Then I have the whole Shadowbringers expansion. And obviously, they've got their Endwalker one coming out as well. So in some respects, I'm like still super behind. I've not even managed to catch up yet. There's that much content. And, you know, I do play a little bit more all-encompassing, I think, than other people. I have friends that will play the story, but they'll just skip all the dialogue and they'll just run through the instances and they'll be done super quickly. But, you know, if you're really trying to dive into the full experience, there are hours and hours and hours. In that context, Is it really possible to play Guild Wars 2 and Final Fantasy 14 alongside one another? Not really. I think if you're a noob to both games, trying to catch up in the story of both games, you're gonna have to pick. I mean, there's just so much there. I do think you would run out of Guild Wars content a lot faster, though. It's just a simple fact, and I don't use this necessarily as an argument against Guild Wars right now, but it's a simple fact that it takes a lot longer and there is a lot more content in Final Fantasy 14. So yeah, once I'm done with this whole catch-up phase, whenever that might be, I hear that Shadowbringers is a much longer expansion, just in terms of like cutscene length. I think it's like hours and hours and hours more. It's like 30 hours of cutscenes or something crazy over the whole expansion, and that's cutscenes alone. But once I catch up, and then probably after Endwalker 2, can I imagine being able to play both games at once? Yes, definitely. I don't know how many people listening to this video right now are in that position, but if you're just waiting for the patches, I mean, it's brilliant. I've been watching the timelines very closely, like when does Final Fantasy release a patch versus when does Guild Wars release a patch, and it's only very rare that they, like, clash. So let's be clear, Guild Wars, since the layoffs and the end of Season 4, has kind of been in a nightmare position where their patches have been really inconsistent, or they've been like mini patches like we saw through Champions. And then, of course, most of this year, there's basically been nothing for Guild Wars because of COVID. That's also true for Final Fantasy, I suppose. But basically, there is a whole era of Guild Wars where patches were really wobbly, and they weren't for Final Fantasy. But if we rewind the clock to when ArenaNet had everything going out like clockwork, when we look at, you know, the end of the whole way through Season 3, Path of Fire's release Season 4, you can compare what was Final Fantasy doing. Final Fantasy actually had less patches, each one's more meaty, I would say, on an individual level, because they tend to balance, you know, their end game stuff like Alliance raids and regular raids with some regular story, and ArenaNet never quite hit that balance. But if you look at the timelines, they were both totally playable. You could definitely zigzag between the two. As far as I can see for now, there are 2 dates ever, 2, in which both games released a patch on the exact same day. It was during Season 4. There was a patch in the post-Stormblood era for Final Fantasy, when the Goesetsu and Yotsuyu story was going on, and that was on the exact same date as the Jahai Bluffs came in Guild Wars 2, and then again, like a couple of months later, it was the same thing too. When Thunderhead Peaks came out in Guild Wars, there was another Stormblood patch for Final Fantasy. 2 days where you would have had to make a real decision. Okay, do I have to pick one game or the other? But beyond that, I think you're fine, because here's the thing, guys. You can beat both of these games' patches in one evening. So I say one evening, right? Because I'm imagining we're a normal human being with a full-time job. We get home and we have an evening to play a game. If it's on patch day, you can definitely beat a Guild Wars 2 Living World patch. You can't 100% it. You can't get all the meta achievements and all the extra collections and stuff, which is actually something I think Guild Wars does a bit better with its patches than Final Fantasy does. You can't do everything in an evening, but you can certainly get through the story and the key beats in an evening. And the same is true with Final Fantasy. You can get through all the key beats. The trick with Final Fantasy, though, is, as I just alluded to, they do always put something decent for endgame in there. Like, they'll put some 8-man content in there, or there'll be a trial in there, or there'll be the Alliance raid. Oftentimes, there'll be multiple. And when that happens, you know, if that's difficult content, progression-oriented content, and, you know, you've got a group of people and you're going to be learning it, well, that's obviously not a one-evening thing. That's something that may even take you upwards of a week or more, right, depending on what it is. And so all of a sudden, for veterans, I think Final Fantasy patches are way healthier because they can cling onto those users a lot longer. Meanwhile, in Guild Wars, if you're like a raid enthusiast, you go through a lot of those releases kind of playing the story stuff and then scratching your head as to what you want to do next. Maybe you return to World vs. World and get upset that they haven't done more World vs. World patches or whatever. Final Fantasy caters on that like long-term thing. But as a general rule, yeah, I think you can play both of them. If you're not looking to do that early progression in all their endgame stuff, then definitely. I think you could even zigzag between those and any number of other games, because what are you going to do? There's going to be a Guild Wars patch. You'll probably play Guild Wars for about that week or so. Final Fantasy patch, play it for about that week or so. And then you've got like, what, 2.5 months to chill out and do whatever else you want? It's absolutely doable. I think the games complement each other very comfortably. And even as I just hopefully illustrated in my original review, it's because where one game is really good at depth of its story and lots of interaction with its characters and so on, The other game is much better in another arena, like open world and jumping puzzles. My God, I don't remember how little I talked about it in that previous review, but guys, I've got to say it again. That is really where Guild Wars shines. All the stuff in the open world with the meta events and the mini dungeons and the map completion, all that stuff, it's just light years ahead of Final Fantasy. So you kind of get both ends of the spectrum there. I'm just wondering now how other MMOs feel, and maybe what they demonstrate can be done better too, but maybe a story for later. Let's get another comment here. This is from ZBob42, who says, Final Fantasy... okay, so this was a big response, just a little point of contention. I made the unfortunate mistake in the review of making a kind of controversial, like, almost like light-hearted prod at the game at the start. And here's the thing about YouTube. Very few people actually make it the whole way through the whole video. They'll listen to the start and they'll comment on stuff at the start. So what did I talk about in the start? That fake queue thing. So here's what ZBob says. FF14's queue isn't fake. It was recently implemented as DDoS protection. That's why it's always a fairly short queue. The server isn't necessarily full, although that can be the case. It's just not everyone logging in the second they hit the login button, because DDoSers have taken advantage of that to do some damage over the years. The idea of a fake queue to make the server seem more full is absurd. We're not talking about Blizzard here. Okay, so yeah, my little mischievous prod at the idea it's fake to make the game look more populated. Alright, okay, I understand. That is a bit crazy. So the idea here is that everyone's kind of held in these little pens, I suppose, and you kind of log in pulses, and that puts a cap immediately on any kind of big, crazy DDoS attack where loads and loads of people try and log in or ping the servers too fast. I understand that totally, and yeah, I had so many comments about that. There's not much discussion to have. I wanted you guys to know that I had seen it. So there you have it. Next we got friggin' Paco, who says, on the one hand, the things Guild Wars 2 does right are really right. On the other, when I'm faced with the sheer lack of breadth in the game offers, even in those places where it's hitting hard, makes me wonder what's holding it back. Is it funds? Is it the technology? Is it vision or direction? Is it parent company? What don't we know? Why won't it dare to do more? Why did it take as long as it did for it to be in the position it is right now? I feel like it's so close to a breakout, but it never quite gets there. I think that's a nice way of thinking about Guild Wars 2, actually. And I'm not even exasperated like I was in 2019. I genuinely like the game, but Final Fantasy really does more and does it better, except the feel and flow of combat, which I still vastly prefer in Guild Wars 2. So, yeah, I think basically this is the rub of it. If I was going to distill that whole review and any conversation you ever had about it into the shortest summary I possibly could, it would be that Final Fantasy seems now to be the bigger, more successful game. And the reason for that is because they do more. It's not even that fundamentally the systems are better. Like, when I try and use the trading posts and stuff in Final Fantasy, and then I go back to Guild Wars and I notice just how much richer and better implemented all the systems are and stuff, it's not necessarily that Final Fantasy is better. They just have more content. Guild Wars doesn't do enough. That's the headline. Guild Wars doesn't do enough. And then there's all these questions as to why. I think it's really easy to look at ArenaNet and say, oh, they made all these mistakes trying to do these other projects behind closed doors, and we don't get to see what they were, and they were mismanaged, and we don't know how they were mismanaged, and, you know, it's all just a shit show. It's easy to blame NCSoft and wonder about NCSoft, but I think I do have a little bit of sympathy for the studio, just in as much as I think the rising success of Final Fantasy XIV and the rising success of projects like old school RuneScape and like WoW Classic and all that stuff, and even just the continued success of other old games that you don't even think about. Like, I was reading about the Star Wars MMO the other day. They like re-released one of their trailers in HD. I think all these realizations that an MMO can be a multi-decade long payoff thing, that you really can just stick with that one game and just go and go and go. I don't know whether that was evident until the past, like, 5 years or so. So I have sympathy for ArenaNet being like, yeah, let's make a mobile game, or let's make a Dune MMO. We want a sci-fi MMO. Let's bid for that. You know, whatever they were trying to do. It kind of makes a little bit more sense to me. Now, the other thing I think that might have been going on with ArenaNet is this, and it's something I alluded to in my review. I did have another comment. I haven't pulled it up here. I didn't anticipate talking about this in today's video. But someone said in a comment, they quoted me in my review, and I said, many Guild Wars 2 players will be familiar with the idea of logging in, loving the game, and then wondering what to do, and then they log out. Now that that resonated with a lot of you guys in the comments on the review. That is a serious problem with Guild Wars. That has always been a very, very, very big thing. For Final Fantasy, you don't have that problem because each patch is increasing eye level and expansions are adding more levels to the classes, which means more regular skills for the classes without weird sidesteps like the elite specialization stuff. With Guild Wars, you hit this threshold and you wonder, what do I do? And you just kind of log out, right? Now, that's all a big progression thing. Here's what I think ArenaNet might have been doing when it comes to working on all these other projects. I think ArenaNet wanted to sell the fantasy of a no-grind philosophy MMO. And then, there's all these long-term problems that come with doing that. They wanted to sidestep the long-term problems by just moving you to a new MMO afterwards. It doesn't matter that Guild Wars 2's 80 levels and how it originally set up doesn't work for 15 years, because we're going to have them in a sci-fi MMO in 5 years, or we're going to have them in a Guild Wars 3 in 10 years or whatever. And that's how they kind of wanted to avoid it. I actually think there is a beautiful idea of a no-nonsense, low-grind MMO, shallow progression, with a business model that pushes out new projects on the regular. I think that works, and I wonder if that's what ArenaNet had been doing for all these years, and then who knows about all the mismanagement and why they all got mired. That's kind of my little theory, because I do actually think that's a good idea, and of course we've seen now that they've U-turned on all of it, and they've decided Guild Wars 2 is everything. We're not going to see the fruits of that decision. We're not going to see that parity with catching up with how Final Fantasy does stuff for a long time. I think we did see that. In the Stormblood era versus the Path of Fire era is a really fascinating period for these two games, seriously. And at the time of my previous review, I was only just starting up with Stormblood, but actually being able to map out the Season 4 patches with all of the 4.x series has been very, very eye-opening for me. I don't think the games were too far apart at that point. In storytelling quality, certainly. Final Fantasy was doing really well with that, and in its divulging of its characters and the time we get to spend and stuff. Guild Wars definitely doesn't plan as far ahead for its story as Final Fantasy does, and that's like the big difference, I think, aside from just quantity. But yeah, I think the games were close, and hopefully, if ArenaNet now are fully supporting Guild Wars, we can see they become close again in the future. Because again, that's the headline. Guild Wars is great. It does everything really well. Even now that I've started doing a lot more of the later raids and stuff, I compare like the Omega series raids to like Forsaken Thicket stuff. I honestly think Guild Wars has very elaborate, very cinematic, very beautiful raids. A little bit messy, definitely in terms of like the telegraphs and stuff, but really good. It's just the amount of content pales in comparison to Final Fantasy, which just pushes stuff out and pushes stuff out and pushes stuff out at like a mind-boggling speed. In the post-Stormblood stuff, I was experiencing like 3 storylines. There was the Alliance Raid storyline, there was the main storyline, and there was the Omega series storyline, all going on at once. And Guild Wars, in the meantime, feels like it can barely handle one storyline. Corsair here says, I actually have the inverse of your play experience. I was a long-time Final Fantasy XIV player, dipping into and progressing, as of this moment, into the opening of Heart of Thorns story for the first time. Well, good luck to you, dude. Me and a few friends in my free company are taking a sensible break leading into Endwalker's release, and we're trying out Guild Wars 2. Mostly, I'll add thanks to your videos on the story lore and character builds look intriguing. Well, thank you. We're having a blast so far for everything you point out and reflecting a bit on the others all too real. Mostly over the shock of lack of character connection or development. Your video about the lack of Living World Season 1 in a playthrough helped me and some others cope with suddenly being asked to care about an all-new cast we had never interacted with. I mean, yeah, think about the Season 1 gap, considering that in the context of Final Fantasy is just crazy, isn't it? I mean, Final Fantasy does have a gap. It has the 1.0 gap and the Calamity Patch gap, but they do okay, I think, because it's kind of like a fresh start. Guild Wars' gap is in the middle of the story, and that feels really quite ugly sometimes. Anyway, to finish the comment, they say, our current kind of collective thought, especially as self-professed story-driven players, is that we love the gameplay of Guild Wars 2 that we've gotten so far. We're just hoping the story at some point catches up. Considering the things people have said about the expansion stories being good, that's what we're hoping. Alright, well, I do have a bit of advice for you here. I'm not surprised at all that this has been your experience. And this was a couple of weeks ago now, so I wonder where their little play session's gone through to. I'm not surprised that this is how you feel. I actually think that Guild Wars, for a new player perspective, as you move through, is really strong on that first run through Heart of Thorns. If you're doing everything in order, the idea that you don't have mounts, the jungle without mounts is brilliant. And therefore you really care about getting all the bouncing mushrooms and the ley line gliding and stuff. I think that's all really good. That all counts as gameplay to me. the really rich metas that you start experiencing, the beautiful environments that you start experiencing. As far as the actual characters in the story, how much we talk to them, how connected are you to Air when you watch Air die, for example, at the start of Heart of Thorns. You know, I think I do doubt that you're really engaging with that at this point. And what I would say, my advice to you as a Final Fantasy player now, is if you don't enjoy the story by the middle of Season 3, if you're at like a crack in the ice and you still don't really enjoy the story, I don't know whether you ever will, because I don't know whether the quality has gone beyond that point since then. I think it's pretty much par from the course. And to my Guild Wars viewers listening right now, you guys can argue about that in the comments if you like, but I think there are some great moments. In Path of Fire, they tell a really great story. There are some really fantastic moments where, like, you go to the Mists for a while, the whole library scene and stuff, the final boss battle, and the amazing line, "I'm still standing." There's a lot of fun stuff for you to look forwards to in POF, but the general bar, you're kind of in it. I mean, after that, Season 4, we're kind of in the same area. That again, there are some other highlights. There are definitely big highlights around what you currently know of as a dragon egg. I'll leave it there. But I don't think you're ever going to get as connected or spend as much time with the Guild Wars characters as you did with the Final Fantasy ones. Don't expect it to climb that high. If it ever does, it's going to be with this new expansion, End of Dragons and beyond. And so far, we haven't seen too much evidence that's going to be happening. We'll have to see, you know, how much content depth is actually in this X-Pack as they go forward, because it's just the quantity thing. The other thing I would say, and I know some people were sort of laughing at this comment, some of the story beats also really leave a sour taste in some people's mouths. The most recent proper patch to come in, the Dragonstorm release, was definitely a controversial one. While all the Final Fantasy players say, oh, Shadowbringers, it redefines the whole story, blah, 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 in a brilliant way. Guild Wars has a thing that redefines the whole story as well, I think, and kind of takes the idea of the Elder Dragons and turns it into something else. But you might not like it much. I guess we'll see. I'm trying to be both diplomatic here and avoid spoilers, so maybe I'll move on. Next, we have Mr. Implicit, who says, I just wanted to mention that I've been loving your stream of Final Fantasy. I went through the story myself, but watching you go through the story again has been lots of fun. I consider myself pretty up on the lore, and I pay attention during the story. I spent lots of time reading the wikis for additional information. However, having you go through and ask lots of questions, and all the different minds of the chat having tidbits of information has been absolutely great. I've learned a lot of story things that I didn't know that I didn't know. It was a good review, and I generally agree with your points. Thank you very much for all these compliments. When Guild Wars 2 makes certain systems, such as the classes and the mounts, they do them really well. They feel really well made. 14, though, is just such a big game, and the story feels professional, while Guild Wars 2 often feels like a bit of a fan story. FF14 has great concepts overall for systems with lots of complex ideas and features, but the particulars can be clunky. Yeah, like the trading post thing that I mentioned. If somehow one could get the Guild Wars 2 programmers and system designers with the Final Fantasy story writers and devs. Yeah, this final note you leave here, a lot of you guys have had this lingering thought, you know, oh, what is the perfect MMO? You take the best of both of these two, and what kind of incredible creation would you have come out of the other side? It is definitely a fun thing to fantasize and wonder about. The one thing that does get me curious about your comment here, though, is this idea that Guild Wars feels like a fan story. I've read this a lot. People saying this doesn't feel like Guild Wars. This feels like a bad fan fiction of Guild Wars, and that's the game that I'm playing. You know, that's a very common criticism people have had of the sequel game over the years. And it's funny to me because it's weird. Final Fantasy is a pretty cheesy game quite a lot of the time too. Final Fantasy is pretty hammy, and Final Fantasy is pretty clunky with some of its stuff. You know, it's not all net all the time, but it seems to escape these criticisms, and I think that's just because they have more compelling characters, and they think further ahead when they're, like, streaming plots along, so you feel a lot safer, and it feels more competent. Meanwhile, in Guild Wars, when you miss out on those, and then you miss out on just the sheer quantity and amount of time you get to spend with characters, it's hard to look away from the cheesy and the kind of the flawed bits. That's kind of what I get. I mean, I do sometimes hear people criticize Final Fantasy as having a bad story, and this was something I heard a lot more of before I actually, you know, looked at the game myself and started playing it and learned about it. But people saying, oh, it feels like an anime story, and I don't like anime. And I kind of get what they mean with that. At some point, I think in Final Fantasy, you learn to suspend your disbelief, and you kind of read the room and you realize the kind of story they want to tell, so you just indulge in that kind of story. You don't expect it to be anything outside of its box. And what you end up having is a lot of fun. One thing that does strike me as, like, totally unfair when it comes to the story between the two games is Guild Wars gets so much criticism and crap for bringing a specific character back from the dead. Like, they do a whole story about a character dying, and then they come back, and people can't get over that. But to me, as far as how Guild Wars delivered that, it was like a very well set up, like very clearly explained, proper situation. Anytime any other characters died in Guild Wars, they're dead. Meanwhile, in Final Fantasy, I feel like the majority of the time someone gets injured or killed or goes away or something, suddenly they're just back again later. And they don't even really explain in any way how person X survived event Y. They're just back now. And people buy it on the spot because they're just excited to see the character return, I suppose. But it doesn't feel unfair to me. Like, people hold Guild Wars to a higher standard than they're holding Final Fantasy 2. Another thing Final Fantasy really struggles with is like this cutscene syndrome, where your main character just stands around letting crazy stuff happen because you're in a cutscene and you can't move. That's always frustrating to see, and I don't get that much from Guild Wars at all. Like, I've seen so many situations already where an antagonist is just allowed to walk away, and we don't even try to chase them, just cause. One other thing I kind of wanted to mention, never made it into the review before, guys, is, yes, I haven't played Shadowbringers yet, which is supposedly really good, but for my experience so far, I think A Realm Reborn's core stuff was really rough and really bad, way below anything Guild Wars did. It actually started to get pretty good even before Heavensward, the first expansion. Heavensward itself was alright. A couple of the patches after Heavensward I was kind of meh about, honestly. But then once we hit Stormblood, Stormblood kind of has a weird reputation in the Final Fantasy scene as not being great. Because, you know, it doesn't push like the big lore. They introduce the idea of like the Warriors of Darkness and stuff. They start talking about Hydaelyn and the other worlds. And then all of a sudden we're just dealing with a bunch of stuff, you know, Hingashi, and we're dealing with Girabanya and so on. And it's like, well, this feels like a tangent. So it gets a bad reputation, but I actually think the storytelling gets a lot better in Stormblood. And definitely now, in the post-Stormblood patches, as they're setting up Shadowbringers, it's just gone up and up and up from height to height to height. And you know what's crazy, guys? If you actually compare the release timelines here, Guild Wars was going from height to height to height as well. It's Season 4 versus the end of Stormblood. They were both doing brilliant. And then what's the fundamental difference between the two games? Final Fantasy went on to make Shadowbringers, and Guild Wars ended up going on a big unexpected break, had to reshuffle, and came back with the Icebrood Saga. So, you know, that's just the big moment where Final Fantasy had just been clawing and climbing up and earning its space in everyone's mind as an MMO, and suddenly everything broke on the Guild Wars side. So, you know, I don't think these games are necessarily too far apart. It's just that one big moment right there at the end of Stormblood when one game got Shadowbringers, the other game got nothing, and then the Icebrood Saga. Cool. Can you imagine the difference between being at the Icebrood Saga announcement stream versus being at like the early Shadowbringers press with their trailers and stuff? It's just crazy. And the result is that Final Fantasy is going to have 2 whole expansions now. Not only Shadowbringers, but Endwalker 2. And we're still waiting on End of Dragons. I mean, it's nuts. We're still feeling that reverberate. Okay, so here's a big discussion. I can't remember how much of it came into the review, but here's a statement I completely disagree with. It's Cleveland Brown from Seth MacFarlane, who says, I have to think the underlying reason for the differences between the amount of content these games provide simply comes down to resources. Final Fantasy has a subscription fee, and Guild Wars 2 doesn't. So players get what they pay for. Like, I don't buy this. I think I left a very small comment at the end of the review on this note. I think everybody falls into this trap of saying, oh, it's just because Guild Wars 2 doesn't have a sub, so it's destined to have less content, or it's destined to have lower quality content, or so on. But I don't think that the market really shows that. Guild Wars talked a lot back when Guild Wars 2 was coming out about how sub fees weren't really necessary, that you didn't have to do MMOs with that you could supplement with microtransactions, and really it's how the studio spends the resources they get. Right? Guild Wars chose to spend its resources on other stuff and ended up having a lot of problems. Final Fantasy has to give however many of its resources off to other areas of Square Enix and so on, which obviously both develops and produces publishes a crap ton of games. So they get whatever their slice is. I think this is a mistake to say just because Guild Wars doesn't have a sub. Both games can finance themselves in whatever the way they see fit, as far as I'm concerned. And both games can have more or less content than each other based on the practices of the developers at the studio and what they're thinking about and what they're doing, how they split their focus. It's just resource management. The one thing that is a valid discussion is, do you prefer a subscription fee where a microtransaction store doesn't muscle in on loads of in-game rewards and stuff and make everyone look really shiny and so on? Or do you prefer no subscription fee and everybody's wearing crazy shiny gear all the time, but you have more choice as a consumer as to what you spend your money on? That's the real decision. Are the unfortunate side effects of the Guild Wars 2 gem store, meaning you don't get legendary mounts and you don't get cool items in raids and stuff like that, is that a good trade for not having to pay a sub? That's the question. I don't think content quantity or quality comes into it. And if it does, I don't think we as like pundits and random players out in the communities of these games necessarily have all the finances and stuff to know that, do we? So yeah, I don't really like this argument. I think Guild Wars 2 could be every bit as good as Final Fantasy, even if it doesn't have a sub fee. This next comment is kind of an anti-Guild Wars 2 comment in a big way, but it does actually highlight something I think is quite important, that it's not just the quantity conversation. So it's Cerberus, no, not Cerberus, it's Cerbertus, who says, I used to love the Guild Wars franchise, and I still think Guild Wars 2 has the better gameplay, but I lost my trust in ArenaNet. When I started Final Fantasy XIV back during Stormblood, many people started to complain about the predictable content schedule in FF14. To someone come from Guild Wars 2, where most of the time where you're unsure what will happen in the future, this was mind-blowing. I never knew when the next raid release in Guild Wars 2 would happen. I never knew that there would be a new raid. And at many points I was unsure if there'd be another expansion. When Shadowbringers released, everyone knew we would get 5 major patch cycles. Everyone knew which type of raid was in which patch, how many trials we'd get. Sure, there were some new surprises and much more content than just raids, but we knew the bare minimum we would get. There was a minimal expectation, and everyone was confident that Square Enix would meet those expectations. And if COVID wasn't a thing, we would have been able to guess the release date of all the patches and the next expansion. I think this is very insightful, actually. So there is a lot more to this comment. You guys can pause the video and read it if you like, but this is the thing that I really want to hone in on. I think that that's kind of been a thing for Guild Wars. There have only been limited windows where we know an X-Pack's there. And I think it's, again, because ArenaNet themselves didn't know if a new X-Pack was coming, because they always wanted to do other stuff. So how can they set up a... One thing Final Fantasy does very well is they'll set up a storyline that doesn't pay off for like 2 years because it's next X-Pack or something. Or even longer than that with some things. I mean, Christ, they've clearly got like a big meta story they've been wanting to tell this whole time, which supposedly now finally gets its conclusion in Endwalker. Final Fantasy does that. Guild Wars can't do that in-game through its content because they don't know if they're still supporting another expansion after, say, Path of Fire. So the only time we really saw it was that HOT up to Path of Fire window. Then everything in Season 4, they're not really setting up new things, are they? Because they don't know if there's going to be any new things. And they're not giving us dates, and we can't predict, oh, there's going to be a new expansion here, and there's going to be this kind of patch here, and this kind of patch here. Because they don't know. They're always shuffling people around. And so even more, maybe, than just what's in the games, I think it's hard to be a Guild Wars fan because you're so all over the place. It blows my mind, too, to hear that a Final Fantasy player would complain that their patches are too regular. I mean, Christ, if that isn't a first world MMO problem, I don't know what is. It's too regular, it's too predictable. I mean, maybe, I guess if the idea is that people are looking like for big format shifts and they want totally new features and ideas, but the idea that they're catering to a baseline, with such professional regularity, it's really predictable, that's unbelievable to me. And yeah, I mean, COVID throws a wrench everywhere, but that aside, fantastic stuff. What Guild Wars 2 player wouldn't appreciate or love hearing about that? Okay, so I had a lot of comments here, guys, but I do have to put a cap on the runtime of this video at some point. So here, just 2 more to round out with. I've had a lot of people say this. Now, you're all being vague to me, but this sentiment is everywhere. Cotton Talisfy says the way he's talking about A Realm Reborn and the story sounds like he hasn't done Shadowbringers yet. Checks the VOD, yup. You'll probably amend some of your story perspective. So I don't really know if I buy this. Look, I've heard Shadowbringers is very good. I hear it's got some twists and turns. I hear I'll finally get answers. My honest opinion about the Final Fantasy story right now is tricky because they so often lean on my ignorance. Well, what do I mean by that? Like, I don't really know the true ambition of Varys, right, and the Empire. I don't really know what the Echo means. I don't really know what Hydaelyn's all about. I don't really know what Zodiac... There's so many questions that they're, like, just hanging there. And I've been assured that they get answered and it all feels really satisfying. But I haven't seen any of those responses yet, right? So I wouldn't say I dislike the story right now, but I would say I don't know the story right now. So that's why I'm so excited about Shadowbringers. And I get that it'll be quite transformative from my perspective. But let me say this. Even if Shadowbringers comes with some great revelations, all about ARR and recontextualizes all that stuff, I'll still stand by the fact that it's a very poorly told story. It's very boring and it's full of filler and way too many lines of dialogue to explain too little information. It's not fun. And so in my review, I criticized a Realm Reborn storytelling, and I'm sorry, but I stand by that. Maybe when I beat Shadowbringers, you'll be right. I mean, we will see. So I'll take this time here, guys, to point out I'm starting Shadowbringers tomorrow. It's going to be a live Let's Play, every moment of my experience, first time through, streamed. You guys will be able to watch it, and there'll be videos up afterwards. So that's on Tuesday the 16th. I'm going to be streaming it and playing through it. So far, I've been doing the whole thing blind. I go slow. I enjoy all the story. This is like the best reviewed MMO product I've seen in a decade. Everyone's been raving about it. I can't wait to see it. And I encourage everyone listening to this video, whether you're a Guild Wars 2 fan or a Final Fantasy fan, it will be interesting to see if it pays off on all this community hype. I'm literally about to start it. For the Guild Wars fans, this is the equivalent of when ArenaNet started the Icebrood Saga. Final Fantasy started Shadowbringers, and this is the big moment. So this is really, really, really curious time for the franchises for me, and I'm fascinated to play it. And it's all going to be there live. So if you can make it, make sure, pause the video, check down in the description, and you can see I've got a link to my Twitch channel. If not, don't forget all the VODs appear over there, and they appear on my second channel, WoodenPotatoes too. So hopefully it'll be a fun adventure. You guys liked me going through the Stormblood stuff. Well, Shadowbringers is coming up next. So yeah, and we'll see if I amend my story perspective. Finally, as well, we have this as kind of a round-out comment. This is from Danny, who says, I would love to see you do, and I had a lot of messages like this, I'd love to see you do the same review for Elder Scrolls Online, especially since I think the two games are more similar than FF14 and Guild Wars 2. Yeah, so some people criticized me doing a comparative exercise between these two games because they're so different, and I acknowledge that. And usually when that criticism came in, people said you should compare it to ESO. ESO is apparently a lot more like Guild Wars. Now, I like that idea. Look, if people will watch, and if it's fun to stream, and, we actually have fans and people can teach me things about the game, I would love to do this project again. If today's video actually gets some viewership and people I would love to start doing that kind of stuff. So yeah, Elder Scrolls Online probably is the next one, because I'm a big fan of the Elder Scrolls franchise as well. It's almost crazy to me I haven't really tried these MMOs. So you guys can let me know what you think about that. That would be a bit down the line though, because I'm going to do Shadowbringers, and then by the time I'm done with that, Endwalker's going to come out. Will have been out, sorry. Then I'm going to be Endwalker, then End of Dragons is going to come out. So ESO might be a bit away, but you never know. Maybe I'll go really fast. Maybe we'll be there around Christmas. Who can tell? If people want to watch it. But I like the idea. I really do. I thought this was a very fun project, guys. If you still have a lot of fun thoughts and feedback, and if this video actually gets some attention, and just doesn't just fall apart because, under all the Guild Wars 2 news I'm producing, I would love to do more Q&As about this. It's just I'm kind of nervous that people don't want them. So I'm watching. We'll see how it goes. I'd love to branch more out into this kind of stuff. Just a massive thank you again for all the thoughts and feedback and lovely comments on the previous review. It means the world to me, guys. It really does. So thanks, and I'll see you on the next one very soon, if not tomorrow, for the start of Shadowbringers. Take care now, guys. I don't really have anything great to remind you to link to here. Just seriously, the description, the Twitch link is down there. I don't care if you're Final Fantasy or Guild Wars side. And I'll be explaining what goes on such that you won't have had to have watched all the previous hours. You can just jump in.